would like to thank for the invitation to talk about innovating geriatric care and how it should be changed according to our assessments. On October 10th, I was installed as professor of physiotherapy at Karolinska. And then on the web page that they broadcast this with 8 new professors will be inaugurated at Karolinska. One of them would be me. And I would like to conduct research into how exercise with computer games can lead to a healthier old age. And then this is an interactive web page. So there was an immediate response from an older woman telling, well, this researcher, what he proposes to do and make older adults do, this is wishful thinking. And this sounded like, well, this is the ivory tower, people thinking about fancy things they can do with and for older people, but it does not really fit to my wishes or desires or what I need. I'm well off doing crossword puzzles, going to the swimming pool 3 times a week and reading books. Then I will get the same effect. And we will focus on the question, the main questions, games for older people, why? Why is it that I think that older people should do more gaming? And we will focus on aging, obviously. We will focus on the gait pattern of older adults, falls that are a big problem with older adults, and changes in the brain. And then in this context, we will look into what exergaming can mean. So why would we care for neuromuscular control and healthy aging in an aging society at all? And why should we then focus on brain and gait? What are important mobility components of aging populations? And then obviously gait and gait speed is a very important component. But what is hidden in the gait pattern of many older people is the variability of gait. So the variability of step length, the variability of step time, and other important factors. And then we will try to find an answer on the question, how should or could interventions be designed to improve gait speed, but at the same time we also influence gait variability, and by doing that we will have older adults fall less. The background of this story is the demographic development in Western society, and as an example we have here the population build-up of the European population in 2010. On the left-hand side the men and on the right-hand side the women. And then we see what demographics call a onion. So we have not so many older adults. We don't have a lot of young Europeans being born to replace the existing big part of the middle-aged working force population. For our social care systems, this population build-up is actually ideal right now because we have 6 working force people that sustain and support the living of 1 older adult. However, because of demographic developments, we will have a reversed pyramid, a proportional increase of the older adults, the above 65, and the old adults above 80 plus, in proportion in relation to the middle-aged working force population that will decrease. And we still don't have a lot of young Europeans being born. And this will dramatically change our support systems by only having 2 working force adults having to bring up the money, but also literally the hands on the bed of older adults. So only 2 grown-ups will be there to support an older aged person in 2060. In Sweden, we have an additional problem in the sense that younger Swedes, but in general this is seen in all Scandinavian countries, move away from the countryside, go to the big city centers where they have their education and more attractive leisure time activities. And this leads to a decrease of even more people that are needed to support older adults. So we have to find ways to improve the independence of older adults in our future societies because of these demographic developments that are combined with an emptying of the countryside in Scandinavia especially. But we also see this in the southern European countries and in Switzerland, where I come from as well. One of the problems I talked about in older adults is falls among frail older people in residential care, for example. And we see that in Sweden there are a lot of falls in senior citizens' apartments, old people's homes, and in group dwellings. And we see incidence rates per 1,000 years that are dramatically high. And we can expect, based on the demographic development, that these increases will continue to be at least at the same level, but probably become even worse. And a recent doctoral thesis from Karlstad University said that at present effective fall-related injury prevention strategies for older elderly, and especially among those living in nursing homes, are scarce. So we don't do enough right now, or we don't do the things that we should do based on the current care situation. So what causes actually older adults to become frail? And the cycle of frailty is believed to start with something that we call sarcopenia, a low muscle mass. Because of the aging process, we will decline in functioning, and one of the most important functions related to aging and being independent in activities of daily living would be muscle mass. You need your muscles to move around. And then because of getting this sarcopenia, low muscle mass, this obviously will influence your strength of your body. And you need strength to ambulate, to be mobile, to mount staircases. You will also affect on your cardiovascular system, and this will lead to impaired balance, falls and injuries, immobilization. Your walking speed decreases, you develop a disability and a dependency, your general physical activity will even more decline, and you get into the cycle of frailty. However, we know what to do. Based on a meta-analysis of different studies focusing on the topic of strength training in older adults related to mobility, we know that progressive resistance exercise training with high intensities is the most effective exercise modality for improving preferred gait speed. So this is a good story. We know if we give older adults strength training machines, we let them perform 12 weeks of intensive high resistance training with high intensities, then they will automatically start to improve their walking. But there's one drawback to this question. If we look into another meta-analysis, exercise to prevent falls in older adults, an updated meta-analysis and best practice recommendations, then recommendation 7 states, well, strength training may be included in addition to something like balance training, but doesn't seem to be crucial for an effect of exercise on falls. And this is what we have seen in many studies in which we performed strength training exercises with our older adults, and they indeed started to move faster, walk quicker in daily life, but they didn't fall less. And this is a seemingly contradiction, because we have seen that the cycle of frailty starts with sarcopenia, low muscle mass. And because of that you develop mobility disability. And then it seems obvious that if I start training this sarcopenia or influencing this sarcopenia, and the muscles get stronger and bigger again, then this should also have a positive effect on mobility aspects like walking and falling. But it only affects walking. Who can explain that? Why is that? We get stronger body, stronger muscles, but we don't fall less.
Bad eyesight, perhaps?
Eyesight, perhaps? Yes, it might be that it's eyesight. There are many possible reasons for this, and this is something we have to consider as exercise scientists. And to do that, we first have to focus on what causes falls. So we will watch some falls happening. A woman walking in an empty corridor, seemingly automatically attracted to the only obstacle available in the room, and she bumps into the obstacle and falls. A man with strong muscles, quadriceps, he does a squat, gets up again, plays with the balloon. And bumps into the Christmas tree.
But this guy has also the balance problem.
It's the balance problem, but the big question is why? A man walking his dog. And the last example, a woman standing with her walker frame, trying to turn and fall. In this Canadian nursing home, they have been observing all falls that were happening in a time frame of 2 years and tried to analyze all these falls. And what is the main cause for all these falls? If you do the analysis of falls that you can repeatedly play off again. And the thing that all these falls have in common is that there is an impairment in sensory filtering. People move their body parts in other directions, which means biomechanically that you will have a changing base of support needed to accommodate for the change of your center of mass change. And older adults don't seem to sense this anymore. So they don't get the information out of the periphery, by, for example, eyesight, but also acoustically or sensory, into their central control system, the brain, process this with sufficient short time frames, and then put this into an effective movement. So this longer time to characterize stimuli from the environment in working memory is presumed to explain the deficits in motor processes. And we know from this study, or these two studies actually, that this relates to the executive functioning. The group around Jeffrey Hausdorff in Tel Aviv just at random selected older adults and let them do executive functioning tests. The only test they did is to test their cognitive capabilities. And then they wanted to know, is there a relation between this cognitive executive functioning, which is located in the prefrontal cortex, and the amount of falls in a prospective study. So we have, in this second study that followed up these people for 5 years, 4 groups. Those with good executive functions in red, those with bad executive functions in orange, and then 2 middle groups, green and blue, that had intermediate executive functions. And on the vertical we see the percentage of non-fallers. In the beginning, obviously, nobody falls, so the complete group didn't fall. But it doesn't take long before the first fall events happens and continues to happen in those with bad executive functions. And those with relatively well-preserved executive functions, we see much lesser falls. And now you can say, well, one fall is not a fall. What happens with people that recurrently fall? Do we see the same pattern? And then we see indeed the same pattern those with good executive functions fall relatively less, and those with bad executive functions are the ones that continuously fall.
But can I ask how to determine the healthy old adults? It's just no heart disease or diabetes or include everything?
That's of course a matter of definition. The WHO says health is not the absence of disease, but it's you can feel yourself healthy even if you have a chronic disease or whatever. And they took the health definition of the WHO for this study. So what we tend to forget is that sarcopenia, muscle mass, is important to move because it's contractile and you have a lever, arm and joints that connect these levers, and you need these muscles to perform movements. But that is only a small aspect of functioning. Functioning is determined by the nervous system. You need a control system to give commands to your muscles. And if we continue to only focus on the function of the muscle mass, we forget an important additional structure, the nervous system, that might play an important role as well. And when we think of age-associated strength loss, then we should explicitly also consider the nervous system, because otherwise we will lose important information, and this is important information that might drive our interventions and how we design interventions. And in the meantime, we now think that the skeletal muscle changes that we see is because of a lack of communication with the central nervous system. And if you don't communicate with your muscles anymore, because the central nervous system is impaired because of structural changes either in the brain or in the peripheral nervous system, then your muscle as a receiver doesn't get any information anymore and then declines. So most probably sarcopenia is a cause of earlier changes in the nervous system, and it's not the primary cause for your mobility problems. Because all these structural changes will eventually also develop into functional changes in these structures. And what has this to do with walking? Well, we know that for goal-directed control, you need all these brain connections that are depicted in blue here. We have to get sensory information processed by our prefrontal cortex to give these sensory information sources meaning and put this in a meaningful physical action to respond to this challenging environment. And we also have a stimulus response habitual control system that is located in the brain. And if we will see changes in the brain, then this must automatically affect also our motor system and our motor activities. And in this sense, we should regard walking as a complex motor cognitive tasks that requires attention, executive functions and memory. And without these cognitive functions, your walking will be impaired. And what happens in many older adults on a subclinical level, so it's not diagnosed as a disease, that we see small vessel diseases. White matter integrity is impaired, and we lose a lot of white matter integrity because of microbleeds, especially in the prefrontal cortex, and that is the cause for many gait problems, and we even call it frontal gait disorder. And we also know that white matter hyperintensities predict functional decline in voiding. Voiding is also dependent on your cognitive status, for at least partly. It will affect your mobility, but it will also affect your cognition. At the same time, we see that the metabolism in the brain is impaired. So your regional cerebral metabolic rates of glucose processing will be affected, independent of significant cognitive decline or other health-related factors. So a lot is changing in the brain, metabolically, structural, functional, that has an effect on our mobility problems. And this is translated in disturbances in your walking. For example, if you take stride length patterns of people walking, heel touchdown until the next heel touchdown, we call a stride. And normally if people walk, they walk like a Swiss clock, very regular. And it's very repeatable. And that means that we have a mean value of stride length, but a very, very narrow bandwidth of variability. However, if you're a faller, you have the same mean value for your stride length, but the variability around this mean is much larger. And from systematic reviews, we know that there is something like biological variability, where we have variability between 1.1% and 2.6%, and this is needed to be able to adapt to challenging environments. So we are biological systems, and we have to adapt to the environment. And for that we have this biological variability thresholds or boundaries. However, everything below 1.1 or above 2.6% would be defined pathologic variability. And we see that a faller has a large variability for example, stride time variability. But if you look into other measures, you will find the same. The funny thing is that we also know which brain areas are responsible for this variability control. So these are brain areas that control either temporal gait variability variables, the areas in red, or the spatial gait variability components in purple. And we can imagine when we have small vessel diseases and we have a low metabolic rate in our brain, this will affect these brain regions, and this has to affect our mobility. So what can we do about this? Well, what we can do is recognizing what research tells us. Neurological health, our neurological health, depends on signals sent by the body's large muscles, and especially the leg muscles. And if the leg muscles are activated by standing on them and moving around, you will get directives from the body to the brain in the sense of enhancement of neuroplasticity. If you limit physical activity, then we know from animal research that you will decline the number of neural stem cells by 70%. And this is probably the same for humans. And that's why it's important, if you train older adults, you should do it in a vertical position. You should put them on their legs, because this will induce the precondition for neuroplasticity. And it will not happen if you do it in sitting, while using the big leg muscles. Using the legs, particularly in weight-bearing exercise, sends signals to the brain that are vital for the production of healthy neural cells. And these are essential for the brain and the nervous system. And then we should use something called like neuroplasticity, use-dependent neuroplasticity. We know that practicing movements results in improvements in performance and in plasticity of the motor cortex. And non-practicing has the same, but the opposite effects. If you don't use your brain or your body, then you will decrease your neuroplasticity. And negative neuroplasticity would be induced by non-stimulating activities, by sedentary lifestyle, inadequate nutrition, etc. Positive neuroplasticity, theoretically, would be mental stimulation, social interaction, physical exercise, proper nutrition to name a few. If you do something with older adults that endorses or enhances positive neuroplasticity, you might expect not new nerve cells being built up, but what you might expect is new connections between the existing neurons, synaptogenesis. But then it's important that you use learning paradigms, because we only have sustained new connections when we learn new things. And not if you do repetitive movements all over again, like walking in a treadmill for animals. And we think that we should use exogames for that purpose. Technology-driven physical activities such as video game play that requires participants to move to control the game. So you stand on the pressure-sensitive plate, for example, you get a virtual scenario that you have to observe with your senses, in this case visual senses, but you can also put vibration into the plate, or you can give acoustic information, and this has to be processed and put into a meaningful action in order to be successful playing the game. And an individual that plays such an exogame will increase neural activation, and it promotes muscle fiber tension, and by promoting muscle fiber tension you will enhance trophic factors that are important for the brain and the neural development. So that would be the theory. And we know from sports science and from music investigations that if you use virtual reality or you learn to play new skills, music skills or sports skills, you will affect on the brain by structural changes, and you will also affect on the brain by improved outcome of the brain, improved behavioral measures. And the good thing about virtual reality is that you have a simulated safe environment where all the adults will not fall because you can control the environment. Your brain, however, treats the virtual environment as if it is a real environment. So it will process real information. And real-life experiences are the best way to learn and remember. And experiences in virtual reality help you to learn better, remember more, and improve your functioning. So what do we know from studies with young adults? One of the first studies investigating what happens in the brain based on exogaming was performed with young Japanese students, and they found out that if people play a game in standing position where they have to use their large leg muscles and at the same time interact with the virtual environment, they will show increased functioning in the medial tegmental gyrus, which is responsible for taking in sensory information and processing it. But they also see adaptations in the prefrontal cortex where we have to plan our movements and have our executive functioning seated. If you have naive students starting to play Super Mario, in which they have a 2D environment to orient themselves in and a 3D dimensional scenario to see where in the game they are until they can free the princess, if you measure these people, the hippocampal structure and the prefrontal cortex again, and you repeat that measurement after 12 weeks of exogaming, you see growth of neural structures in the hippocampal structure and in the prefrontal cortex again. So this is a sign that your brain reacts plastic on playing in a virtual environment with cognitive challenges while moving around in this virtual environment. Yep.
How this plasticity, the time window, so it's how quick?
Yeah, I think that's the basic question. With young adults, very quick, within weeks. And you can even I would assume, detect it within one exercise session. The big question is, how is it for older adults that have a decline? But theoretically, yep.
Yeah, I had a question regarding that. We have seen a lot of young generations that they don't have movements like physical activities.
Mm-hmm.
What can cause, for example, when they get adult? I mean, when they get older. So does it have any fees? Is there any studies which shows that is there any difference between the people who has a lot of activities when they are young and when they get older? So
the differences will be the amount of neurons built in your brain. So your reserve will be much bigger if you have been playing around in your youth compared to not having played around. And we know the same goes true for osteoporosis, for muscle mass. What you invest in your young age time, you will take advantage of in your later life. You will enter adolescence and grown up midlife with a higher amount of neurons.
But But there is no any certain age or number of age which...
No, no, no.
In other words, like the 85 years old, the 90 years old, this still can train it.
Yeah, yes.
Very important presentation. I have a question regarding this Mario Gait and the brain stimulation. The figures you showed, is it related to a logical brain or some excitement, or what brain part is activated in the video games?
Yeah, that's important. We found out that training the brain is like training the body specific. So if you want to improve strength, you should do strength training. If you want to improve executive function, you should train the executive functions. If you want to improve spatial orientation, which is the first area in Alzheimer's disease that decreases because of a degeneration of the hippocampal structure, then you should train spatial orientation games like Super Mario or Tetris. So, but that's actually the question we would like to follow in our research. What should we train and how should we train it? But theoretically, an important question is, can navigational tasks integrated in exogames for seniors be a tool to affect the hippocampus? And by doing that, potentially affect mild cognitive impairment or early stages of Alzheimer's disease. That's something we would like to investigate. What we know from a meta-analysis is that in clinical and non-clinical populations, exogaming is more advantageous compared to physical active control conditions. So if you perform physical activity and you compare it based on the effect on cognitive functions to playing in virtual environments, you will see an advantage of virtual reality. Which makes this a very powerful tool, because the physical activity part in older adults is impaired. If you have an 85-year-old person, she or he cannot comply with the recommendations for physical activity anymore. But if you put this person in a safe virtual environment and give this person a lot of cognitive tasks, then you might get a good effect on the cognition. And we know that especially executive functions, attentional processing and visual spatial skills respond to exogaming. And the majority of these studies were not specific developed for these tasks, so we hope that we can find better solutions in the future with purpose-developed exogames. In the meantime, guidelines and recommendations for physical activity in nursing homes have been adapted, and we should explicitly consider the use of innovative solutions using animal interventions or new technologies in nursing homes to try and improve physical and cognitive functioning in these age groups. Man does not cease to play because he grows old. Man grows old because he ceases to play. And with that, I would like to conclude and thank you for your attention.